I'm very thankful to be able to spend some time with you today and talk about something that means a great deal to me. And when you look at the idea of taking the leap, you're really looking at what is it that I have to do to align what my beliefs are with my actions. Because actions and beliefs are always connected. And so when I look at someone's actions and they say, I want to do this, but they're not doing that, well, if I want to change what someone does, I have to challenge what they believe. And what they believe is really summed up in the idea of a mental model. Our mental models are the representation of how we process the world, and through that process, how we create representations of how the world actually works. And so mental models are formed from the earliest age. Our brain begins to process what's happening and begins to create these neural networks. And I was looking at this and thinking about the stories of people that I've known and how their mental models were formed and shaped and reformed again. I was thinking about my dad. And I wish you could meet my parents because you would love them. And my dad is someone that you would remember meeting. I joke about him. I say that he is 5'7" in all directions because that's kind of the way that he is made. If you talked to him, you would be able to tell pretty quickly that he has been a football coach most of his life. He has a raspy voice from damaged vocal cords. And then he has a cadence that is unusual. And so if you're talking to him, the way he talks is different than most people. And then he has zero volume control, none. And I love him very much. And so we were on a road trip, and I asked my dad on that road trip, it was my dad and my brother and I were traveling together, and I said, Dad, could we go home the long way from our trip and go through your hometown of Marietta, Ohio? Maybe you could show us some of the places that meant something to you. Maybe you could give us some of the stories. He looked at me and he said, I could do that. So we drove into Marietta, and we pulled up to this house I had never seen before, even though I'd been to that town probably 50 times. And he said, now that's the first house I remember ever living in. And he pointed to the house, but he didn't look at it for very long. It didn't dawn on me until later, this may not have been a place that he wanted to remember. He said, that's where I grew up, and told me about that. And then he put the car in drive and went up a block and went over and pulled up where we could see this school in the distance. And he pulled up to the side and he said, now right here is where my life was changed. And he pointed to the football field. And he said, right there, I scored 7 touchdowns in one game right there. And my brother and I were sitting in the car, and we just listened, and we didn't really respond. And he took our silence as if we were skeptical. And so he looked back at us, and he said, it was in the paper and everything. And he wanted us to know that really happened. He said, but right there is where my life was changed. The school was where he went to the 6th grade the first time. He was in what they called back then the slow kids class, which is an unfortunate naming because there are a lot of bright people who aren't good at school. But he's in class one day, and Mr. Casto came by. Mr. Casto was the football coach, and he was the assistant principal. And Mr. Casto came by and said to my dad, Dave, I need to speak with you. And so my dad went over there, and he said, Dave, we've got a new student in our school today. His name is Daniel, and Daniel can't read. And Dave, I would like for you to teach Daniel how to read. My father looked at him, and he was stunned by the request. And he looked back at the principal, and he said, I can't do that. And Mr. Casto said, well, why not? And my dad said, because I'm dumb. And Mr. Casto, in the way you could only do in the 1950s, looked back at him, and he said, well, Dave, you may be dumb, but you're not as dumb as Daniel. So teach Daniel how to read. And my brother and I are sitting in the car listening to this. And I don't know what to say. I thought it was going to be a positive story because he said my life was changed. I didn't think it was going to be a negative thing. And I said to him, well, Dad, I don't know where to go with that. I said, was it a positive story? And he laughed. And he said, oh, it was very positive. He said, it changed my life. On that day, I realized I didn't have to be the smartest person in the world to make a difference. That if I was just a little farther down the road than somebody else, I could serve them. Changed my life. But the mental model, he believed something about himself. He believed that he was dumb. Well, the reality was he was growing up in a home that was chaotic. He was growing up in an environment where he was struggling. And then he had dyslexia, and it had never been diagnosed. In reality, he was working much harder than everybody else to get an average grade, and that hard work, that effort would make the difference later. But he didn't know any of that at that age. Fast forward. I grew up in a home because of how my dad grew up and how my mother grew up. She grew up in a very stable home. They had this really unique relationship. And so they said, when my brother and I were growing up, they said, we should bring more children into this home. I don't remember a time growing up where we didn't have foster children in our home for a weekend or 2 or 3 years at a time. I remember one day, we had a boy come into our house. When they came into our home, they became a part of our family. And he came in, he was 3 years old. His name was Adam. And Adam walked into the house with the caseworker, and we were trying to do the introductions and everything else. And Adam is angry, he is frustrated, and he has had enough. The caseworker is trying to calm him down. At the age of 3, he turns around, makes a little bitty fist, and as hard as he can possibly punch the caseworker, punches her in the eye, breaks her glasses, and blood begins to drip immediately. My parents took the woman into the kitchen trying to help her with the cut. And as they're doing that, Adam got up and snuck into their bedroom, and he took my mother's nail polish and undid it all, and then would put it all over the bedspread, and then take that, and he would take it on his hands and put it all over the wooden furniture. Mom walked into the room, saw what he had done, and she said, Adam, what are you doing? And he put his little bitty fists on his hips, and he said, don't tell me what to do. And he's 3. Now, this is his normal. So what do you do with a mental model? How do you change it? When Adam was a little bitty kid, he may have been just 2 years old, his mother filled the bathtub up with scalding hot water, and she put that child of her own into that water, and every inch of his tender skin that hot water touched, it would leave a forever scar. Defenseless. That's why he came to our house. So when it came bath time, that was not going to go over well. He was terrified. And Dad would put on his swim trunks, and he'd get in that bathtub first. He'd put his hand under the water. He would let him see he would not be burned. But Adam wanted to touch the water himself, and he'd put his hand under the water. And eventually he could take a bath by himself, but not quickly. He couldn't be hugged. He wouldn't show affection. Until Christmas. He got the flu, and he got it bad. He came into the living room. Mom was sitting on a rocking chair, and he came into the living room, and he was just exhausted. And he saw my mother, and he climbed up into her lap, and we all just sat so still. Couldn't believe it. And he crawled up into her lap, and for the first time in his life, he was rocked to sleep in the arms of a loving mother. Now, what's happening? His brain was remapping. The people who had been the source of pain, he was having this conflict because now maybe people like that are not the source of pain. Maybe they are the source of comfort. Now, here's the challenge of changing the way you think. The challenge of changing the way you think is that your brain is incredibly efficient, and it wants to go to what is routine. It wants to do what is the routine, the habit. And if you want to change your mind, you have to be willing to fight for it, and you are the only one who can do it. But your brain is not fixed. Your mindset is not fixed. You can change today the way that you think, but it will take effort and it will take time. If you want to take the leap, I would say this to you. My dad called one day and he said, son, I've been thinking. I think I'd like to start hiking. All right. I said, what are you thinking? He said, have you heard of the AT? The Appalachian Trail, 2,170 miles. I said, Dad, yes, I've heard of the AT. He said, well, I'm thinking about section hiking it. Maybe go for a week at a time. All right. Most people don't start their hiking career in their 7th decade who have never done this before. And so I thought to myself, maybe I need to go with him and help him. And so I said, maybe I need to go with you, Dad. He said, you don't need to go. I've recruited your uncle, who is older than him. He said, we're going to do this. All right. Gets there, and sure enough, they do it for a week. It was a tough experience. But you know what I found interesting? That if you hike the AT from the southern terminus, if you're from the southern starting point, and you make your way up from Georgia, you start off, and then you have a mile 1, 5, 10, and at mile 31 or so, there's a store. And that store is called Mountain Crossings. And it's a famous place because it's the only place on the entire AT where you walk through a place that has a roof. And in that store, it's an outfitter store, and they're world famous for this. Everybody who works there, with the exception of one, has through-hiked the entire Appalachian Trail. And they have this service there, and it's called the Pack Shakedown. This is what that means. You can walk into that store carrying your pack, and you can take off your pack and put it there in front of them, and they will take everything out of your pack, and they will tell you what you don't need to carry anymore. Now, here's my thing. If that store was in mile 1, it would not be successful. It is successful because it's in mile 31. You have carried that weight long enough to be open to and seeking counsel from guides who would tell you what you don't have to carry anymore. This is the reality. You've endured enough pain not to worry about it so much. Because at mile 1, you would have to stop believing somebody who told you you needed this. In mile 31, you've had enough life to realize you don't get extra points for this. Now, here's the reality. Many of you, and myself included, at the beginning of your life, you're thinking, what do I need to add to be able to get where I want to go? What if it's not an addition? What if it's a subtraction? Because my dad at the age of 9, 10, or 11 believed something about himself that wasn't true. Adam, when he surrendered and crawled up into my mother's lap, he found liberation. Every time he would put his hand under that water and he found that it would not burn him, he was remapping his brain. And I would say to you the same. If you want to take the leap, what does it require? It's not about what you add. It may be about what you subtract. There's a 14-year-old version of yourself that started believing something that wasn't true, but at 14 you didn't know better. And sometimes what I see people doing is that the 19-year-old version of themselves is still driving this thing. Maybe it's time to let the you of now decide where you get to go from here. Your brain is not fixed. The way you think is not concrete. If you want to learn how to play the piano, you can. Right now, my parents, I hope, are watching this presentation in Guatemala, where they have a medical mission group that has come together to serve the Guatemalans and the Mayan Indians. Because my dad realized one thing. You don't have to be the smartest person in the world to make a difference. You just have to be willing to serve. Thank you.